Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shoes of a man who traveled across oceans, ventured into the heart of the Holy Land, and emerged with his wit sharper than ever. Imagine Mark Twain with his distinctive humor and sharp observations setting off on a journey to Jerusalem in 1867. That's right, this unlikely pilgrimage wasn't about religion for Twain, but about his thirst for the exotic, and let's be honest, the sheer novelty of it all. You probably won't survive this adventure without a few chuckles. Twain had a knack for turning even the most sacred moments into something you could laugh about. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1867, and Mark Twain, fresh off his famous book Innocents Abroad, finds himself in Jerusalem, a city with layers upon layers of history, a place sacred to millions. But for Twain, this is less about reverence and more about sightseeing, with a rather sarcastic twist. His decision to travel to the Holy Land wasn't born out of any spiritual calling, but more out of the same curiosity that led him to poke fun at everything from European aristocracy to American society. His journey wasn't just about visiting holy sites. It was an opportunity for Twain to observe the foreign with his typical eye for humor and absurdity. The idea of a well-known American author strolling through Jerusalem in 1867 must have been a curious sight. Imagine Twain with his iconic white suit, stepping into a land thick with history and culture that was centuries older than anything he'd seen back home. He approached this journey with all the enthusiasm of a modern-day tourist, except instead of a camera, he had a pen and a razor-sharp sense of humor. The first thing that caught his attention, as it did with many visitors, was the old city. The winding alleys, the towering walls, and the mix of cultures. Christian, Jewish, Muslim, all jostling for space. Twain's commentary wasn't the least bit reverential, though. Instead, he found the whole place a bit confusing. He quickly realized that for someone accustomed to the straight lines of American life, Jerusalem's chaotic blend of ancient history and living, breathing culture was a shock to the system. One of his first jabs was at the overcrowded marketplaces with their narrow streets and eternal congestion, a far cry from the cleanliness and order of New York City, where he had just spent a considerable amount of time. Historians still argue whether Twain's portrayal of the city was tinged with cynicism, or just the honest reflection of a man seeing the world through his own lens. One thing is for sure, though, Twain wasn't here for a religious pilgrimage. His goal was to write about it, but more importantly to make his readers laugh at the peculiarities he observed. And laugh he did. His sharp wit was at its best as he described the atmosphere in Jerusalem, so thick with history and cultural significance that it made his dry, observational humor seem all the more striking. Even with the weight of the city's sacred significance hanging in the air, Twain couldn't help but find the situation absurd at times. How could anyone take this city seriously when the streets were filled with merchants selling everything from religious trinkets to overpriced carpets? But the real comedy came from Twain's observations of the local customs. You see, Twain didn't just watch from the sidelines, he actively engaged with the people, sometimes out of curiosity, and other times because he simply couldn't resist. The way the locals dressed, spoke, and went about their daily routines fascinated him. At one point he quipped about the local merchants, "These fellows will sell you anything they can find, whether you need it or not." Sound familiar? It seems not much has changed in the art of salesmanship. Twain's journey wasn't a grand spiritual awakening. It was an eye-opening adventure through a land steeped in history layered with cultural traditions that weren't always easy for him to comprehend. But as you're about to see, Twain's unique perspective allowed him to see humor in the very things that most people would consider sacred or too serious for jokes. As we continue, we'll follow Twain's experiences through Jerusalem's winding streets and beyond, witnessing how his typical comedic flair made even the most solemn of locations seem like a comedy sketch. As Twain ventured deeper into Jerusalem, he couldn't help but let his eyes dart to the strange blend of cultures he found there. Old world meets new world, religion meets everyday life. He was never one to shy away from poking fun at the idiosyncrasies of the people he encountered, and this time his observations of the local customs offered him plenty of material. The daily routines of Jerusalem's inhabitants, whether it was the prayer rituals at the Western Wall or the communal hustle through the crowded streets, seemed at odds with what Twain was used to in the United States. Yet he treated it all with a gentle mockery that somehow made the culture feel both strange and familiar at the same time. One of the quirks that caught Twain's eye was the local tradition of pilgrimage, something that many visitors to Jerusalem were there to do. Pilgrims, both local and foreign, flooded the holy sites in droves. To Twain, this seemed like the kind of spectacle that could only be truly appreciated through the lens of comedy. He observed how the pilgrims shuffled through the city with a combination of awe and impatience, as if they were part of an unspoken race to reach the next holy site. "It's a great place for a holy marathon," he wrote sarcastically. "Just wait until they get to the Holy Sepulchre, where the finish line is marked by an ancient tomb." Twain's humor didn't stop with the religious customs. The very concept of pilgrimage, which seemed so serious to others, was met with his usual quizzical gaze. Why, he wondered, did people put so much stock in the belief that these places, some of which were worn, weathered, and not much more than buildings with religious significance, were the physical embodiment of holiness? He described the place with a mix of skepticism and respect, remarking that Jerusalem might be the only city where you could buy a relic for a penny and a prayer for a dime. This is the essence of Twain's humor, a careful balance of genuine curiosity and sharp-witted commentary. He didn't dismiss the religious significance of the sites, but he didn't let that stop him from pointing out the absurdities of human behavior and belief. For Twain, it was not just the city's ancient walls that fascinated him. It was the way the people used these walls to define their daily lives. And as he continued his journey through Jerusalem, he noticed another aspect of local life that struck him as particularly amusing: the way the citizens of Jerusalem seemed to approach the blend of the sacred and the mundane. For example, while the locals could be found praying devoutly at the Western Wall, they were also bargaining hard for souvenirs like they had completely forgotten the ancient stones at their backs. Twain observed this with great amusement and couldn't resist comparing it to the way New Yorkers went about their own daily business, fast-paced driven, but somehow disconnected from the deeper meaning of the places they inhabited. Historians still argue whether Twain's satirical approach was a subtle commentary on religion or simply a product of his own cultural context. But one thing remains clear: his observations were never out of malice. Instead, they were driven by the same curiosity that had led him to explore other foreign lands, and of course his desire to entertain his readers with his inimitable comedic flair. But it wasn't just the religious sites that captured Twain's attention. He found humor in the customs and rituals that were far more mundane, yet equally as curious. For instance, he couldn't help but laugh at the way some of the local vendors, whose livelihoods depended on selling religious artifacts, seemed to be caught in a state of perpetual salesmanship. Twain observed how these vendors would try to charm tourists with exaggerated claims about the authenticity of their products, as if each item was blessed by the very hands of ancient prophets. "A holy relic for $5, Twain quipped. "That's the best deal I've seen all week." And as he roamed through Jerusalem's old city, the dichotomy of the sacred and the commercial became even more evident. The marketplaces, which were lined with stalls selling everything from holy oil to olive wood carvings, were a far cry from the holy temples he had expected. Twain's account of the city's bustling markets, a stark contrast to the silence he had imagined, was one of his funniest. He mused that the only thing more sacred than the religious relics in Jerusalem was the art of bartering. Twain's playful examination of this blending of sacred and secular customs highlighted a cultural phenomenon that was both amusing and unsettling to him. In his eyes, it wasn't just the holy sites that demanded attention. It was the way those who visited these sites acted in their daily lives that revealed much more about the nature of human beings. As the days wore on and Twain explored more of the city, he began to see just how different this world was from his own. The differences, of course, were rooted in centuries of history, culture, and religion, but it was through his humorous observations that Twain was able to make sense of the things that baffled him. His views on the sacred practices and his encounters with the locals were not judgmental. Rather, they were honest, curious, and deeply funny in a way only Twain could deliver. By now you can imagine that the streets of Jerusalem were not just bustling with people and history, they were steeped in stories. Twain's next stop was a journey to the most sacred place of all, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This was the site that, according to Christian tradition, contained the very spot where Jesus Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. To most pilgrims, this was a place of deep reverence. For Twain, however, it was a setting ripe for more of his signature humor. He approached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with an open mind, though no one could accuse him of being overly pious. The church was packed with religious devotees, each caught in a quiet reverence that Twain, typically cynical, always inquisitive, found both foreign and amusing. People knelt, prayed, kissed the stone, and acted as if they were in the presence of something far beyond this world. Twain's observations, however, were anything but serious. "One would think," he noted, "that the very stones in this church were forged in heaven by angelic hands, but the truth is they're probably just well-polished rock." As he stood in the dimly lit church watching the local priests chant their prayers, Twain couldn't help but wonder how anyone could walk through such a place and still think the world was anything but a strange, messy collection of contradictions. He described the church's rituals with a mix of awe and skepticism, noting that while the architecture might be breathtaking, the rituals seemed almost absurdly human. People, he observed, performed what amounted to spiritual calisthenics, moving from one holy spot to the next with the urgency of someone trying to finish a difficult puzzle. Twain's humor didn't just extend to the pilgrims and their reverence, it was aimed at the very process of religion itself. He couldn't help but chuckle at the notion that sacred places like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which were meant to invoke deep spirituality, could also be markets for emotional transaction. You could almost see the pilgrims waiting their turn to kiss the sacred stone or light a candle as if it were a checklist on their path to salvation. Twain had a way of capturing these moments of overzealous devotion without ever mocking the people involved. He simply found the rituals in their earnestness to be both curious and, well, quite funny. Historians still argue whether Twain was poking fun at the sacred itself, or whether he was more interested in the human behavior around it. But whatever the case, his humor never detracted from the spiritual significance the site held for others. In fact, Twain's skepticism often enhanced the weight of these rituals, making the entire experience feel both more real and more absurd at the same time. His observations acted as a mirror showing how people interact with sacred spaces, while reminding his readers that at the end of the day, everyone is just trying to make sense of a complicated world. After leaving the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Twain continued his exploration of Jerusalem's spiritual landmarks, but his humor remained grounded in his unique blend of respect and irreverence. Whether he was describing the way pilgrims would crowd around the altar, or how the priests moved about in their dark, flowing robes, Twain's sense of the absurd was always lurking just beneath the surface. It was his way of acknowledging the strangeness of it all, while never once denying the profound impact these rituals had on the people around him. For Twain, it was a balancing act between admiration and mockery, between reverence and playful irreverence. It's interesting to note that while Twain's humorous writing style often painted a picture of the sacred world in a light-hearted way, he wasn't wholly dismissive. His comedic touch allowed him to explore these complex rituals from an outsider's perspective, highlighting their oddities while acknowledging their importance to those who practiced them. In fact, Twain's balance between humor and respect for the cultural and religious practices he encountered was one of the reasons his accounts of these journeys were so memorable. They made readers laugh, yes, but they also gave them a unique window into a world few would ever see for themselves. As Twain continued his travels, he found that the more he engaged with the people and places of Jerusalem, the more he realized how much of this city was built on layers of history, belief, and human striving. The sense of awe that others felt in the presence of the city's ancient stones, rituals, and religious landmarks was something he could not help but question. But as he wandered through the alleyways of the old city, it became clear that his own form of awe was wrapped up in his ability to observe and, yes, to make jokes about what he saw. His humor, however, did not serve as a dismissal of the importance of these sights to others. It was simply his way of processing it all. In a place so filled with history, devotion, and significance, the presence of humor allowed Twain to make sense of the contradictions and complexities that surrounded him. His journey through Jerusalem, though anything but conventional, was in its own way deeply insightful. As Twain continued his journey through Jerusalem, the more he observed the interplay between the old-world gravitas and the liveliness of daily life. There was something so starkly different about the way this ancient city hummed with both reverence and absurdity. His next destination was Bethlehem, but to get there, Twain had to ride a camel. And of course, if you're Mark Twain, nothing could go unnoticed without being dissected with humor. It wasn't so much the camel ride that captured Twain's attention, after all. It was hardly his first experience with animals on a journey. It was more the situation as a whole. Imagine, if you will, Twain perched atop a camel, plodding through the dusty desert on a path that would have been as unfamiliar to most travelers of the time as it was to him. The vast emptiness around him, the solitude of the journey, was completely at odds with the spectacle of traveling on a camel, an animal whose gait was as awkward as a lumbering ox trying to do ballet. Twain's humorous account of his camel ride is not just a portrayal of an uncomfortable mode of transport, but a sharp commentary on the absurdity of his situation. He described the camel as a kind of unwitting co-conspirator in his discomfort, one who seemed entirely too self-assured in its movements, despite the ungainliness of the ride. If you were ever so fortunate, Twain wrote, to get a camel to step in a direction you wanted it to, you'd think you'd won a gold medal. He went on to describe the unique rhythm of the ride, comparing it to a lumbering waltz where no one quite knows the steps, and the camel is convinced that every sway of its body is part of some grand secret dance. This ride wasn't just a test of endurance, it was a test of Twain's ability to find humor in everything around him. Though he was far from the bustling streets of New York where life moved quickly and every moment seemed structured, he was now in the middle of the vast Middle Eastern desert, a land of sweeping silence and ancient echoes. And yet he couldn't help but laugh at his own discomfort. The camel, in all its grace and awkwardness, became a symbol of the curious way that Twain approached the world, finding humor in the most unexpected of places. Historians still argue whether Twain's portrayal of the camel ride was an exaggeration for comic effect, or whether he truly found the whole experience that ridiculous. Either way, it's undeniable that Twain's ability to turn discomfort into comedy was one of the reasons his travel writings were so beloved. His ability to laugh at the awkwardness of a situation, to make light of what others might find frustrating, made him relatable to anyone who had ever been put in an uncomfortable position, even if that discomfort happened to be riding a camel. As the ride continued, the desert stretched endlessly before him, and for Twain, this vast expanse wasn't just an empty space, it was a stage for his humor. He quipped that the landscape was so empty you could hear your thoughts echo off the distant hills, but only if your thoughts were as bored as you were. The starkness of the desert, the silence, and the sweltering heat were in Twain's mind simply part of the grand comedy of life. Where others might have found the desert overwhelming or oppressive, Twain found in it the perfect backdrop for his sardonic observations. Eventually, Twain arrived in Bethlehem, but his journey was far from over. This small town, so significant in Christian tradition, didn't leave him speechless as it might have done to other visitors. No, for Twain, the sense of the sacred wasn't nearly as important as the way the place felt to him personally. The streets of Bethlehem, filled with tourists and locals alike, seemed to mirror the rest of his observations about Jerusalem, an odd combination of reverence and commercialization, the sacred woven through with the everyday. Twain's wry sense of humor had followed him through every ancient site he visited, and it was no different in Bethlehem. Standing in the town where Jesus was born, Twain made a remark that still echoes today. It's as if every city in the Holy Land had its own gift shop. And Bethlehem. It's no exception. He wasn't being flippant about the sacredness of the location, but he couldn't help but notice the contrast between the devotion of the pilgrims and the hustle of the marketplace. For Twain, the commercialization of religion wasn't new. It was a reflection of the very human nature that he always sought to explore through his writing. Twain's wit was never more evident than when he wrote about the local guides in Bethlehem, who, with all the gravitas of history on their side, showed him around with great enthusiasm. His guide, a local man, pointed out various sites connected to the birth of Christ, from the humble manger to the cave where it all supposedly happened. Twain couldn't resist commenting on how much the tour resembled the sightseeing tours in other parts of the world. It's like visiting a historical amusement park, Twain said, without the roller coasters. Of course, this wasn't meant as a dismissal of the city's significance. It was simply Twain's way of observing that even the most sacred places through the lens of a traveler could feel like just another stop on a world tour. For Twain, the contrast between the sacred and the commercial, the historical and the mundane, was never more apparent than in the Holy Land. His ability to capture the oddities of both worlds where history clashed with the realities of modern tourism was what made his journey so memorable. Each visit to a holy site was not just an opportunity to reflect on religion, but a moment to comment on the absurdity of how humans, through their rituals, try to make sense of the world. After his trip to Bethlehem, Twain's journey through the Holy Land continued to unfold in the same quirky and reflective way. But now, with his camel ride behind him and his observations about sacred sites fresh in his mind, Twain turned his attention to the natural wonders surrounding Jerusalem. And of course, no journey through the Holy Land would be complete without a stop at one of the world's most famous natural wonders, the Dead Sea. For most visitors, the Dead Sea represents an opportunity to float in its mineral-rich waters and experience its legendary buoyancy. For Twain, however, the allure of the Dead Sea wasn't just about the float, it was about the quirky oddities of the place that seemed perfectly suited for his type of observational humor. As Twain approached the Dead Sea, he was struck by how the landscape seemed almost otherworldly. The salt-encrusted shores stretched endlessly before him, with the distant hills of Jordan casting a surreal, muted glow over the scene. But it wasn't just the striking appearance of the Dead Sea that caught his eye. It was the people around it, and the odd, almost mystical allure it had for visitors. As Twain waded into the salty waters, he couldn't help but note the absurdity of it all. It's as if Mother Nature herself decided to put all the salt in the world into one place, he quipped, and then decided to make it the only place where you could float effortlessly. Twain's description of floating in the Dead Sea was classic. Twain humorous, yet full of vivid imagery. He marveled at the sensation of being unable to sink, joking that it was the only time in his life he felt like he was suspended in time and space without any control over his own body. It's a strange experience, Twain mused, floating in water that you can't even dip your toes into without feeling like you're about to launch yourself into the heavens. The high salt content of the Dead Sea, which makes it impossible to sink, also made for an experience that was both surreal and slightly comical. The water slick with minerals made every movement feel exaggerated, as if the very sea were mocking human attempts at swimming. But beyond the humor, Twain found a deeper commentary in the Dead Sea. It was, after all, a place that people flocked to for its purported healing powers. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and later civilizations had revered the Dead Sea's unique properties, believing that its waters could cure ailments, heal skin conditions, and even restore energy. Twain, always the skeptic, couldn't help but poke fun at these grand claims, but he also couldn't deny the quiet fascination the place held for those who had visited it long before he had. Historians still debate whether Twain's dismissiveness of the Dead Sea's healing properties was simply a playful jab, or whether he genuinely felt that the medicinal claims were exaggerated. What's clear, however, is that Twain's natural curiosity about places like the Dead Sea, which seemed so charged with myth and mystery, allowed him to weave humor into the otherwise solemn atmosphere. As he looked out over the shimmering waters, he reflected on how human beings, whether in the ancient past or the present day, would always seek out the magical, the mysterious, and the miraculous, even when they knew better. It was for Twain a great reflection on the human propensity to turn even the most ordinary phenomena into something extraordinary. And yet, as much as Twain found the whole experience amusing, there was something oddly calming about the place. Even with his biting humor, Twain couldn't help but feel the strange peace that came from being suspended in the Dead Sea's buoyant waters. The combination of salt water and the quiet solitude of the area gave him a unique sense of reflection. For a man who had so often mocked the seriousness of religious rituals and the solemnity of holy sites, this natural wonder was one that brought him into a different frame of mind, one that was less about ridicule and more about quiet, personal reflection. His reflections weren't without humor, of course. Twain couldn't resist joking that the experience of floating in the Dead Sea was like the universe's way of telling you to relax. In fact, throughout his journey, Twain's ability to find humor in even the most awe-inspiring and peaceful settings allowed him to embrace the world in all of its complexity. His skepticism about religious rituals and the supernatural didn't diminish his ability to appreciate the beauty of the natural world. It simply provided a different lens through which to view it. As Twain floated in the Dead Sea surrounded by the silence of the desert and the distant hills of Jordan, he realized that this was a place where even his biting humor couldn't quite capture the full experience. It was a rare moment when the absurdity of life gave way to a kind of quiet wonder, a moment of serenity that made all the earlier sarcasm feel distant. Perhaps it was the saltiness of the water, or perhaps it was the historical weight of the place. But for a moment, even Twain felt small. And that perhaps was the greatest comedy of all, that in a world so full of contradictions, even a man as self-assured as Twain could feel at peace with the absurdity of it all. After the surprisingly tranquil experience of the Dead Sea, Twain's next adventure took him deeper into the heart of the ancient world as he made his way to Egypt. Cairo, the bustling metropolis at the crossroads of African and Middle Eastern history, was a far cry from the peaceful salt-encrusted shores he had just left behind. The energy of the city was palpable, busy markets, crowded streets, and the constant hum of human activity. Yet Twain, ever the keen observer, couldn't help but notice how out of place he felt. What struck him most about Cairo wasn't just the sprawling cityscape, but the grandiose historical monuments that stood like quiet sentinels in the midst of the modern world. And of course, the first and most awe-inspiring of these monuments was the Great Pyramid of Giza. Twain, standing before this colossal structure, was struck by the sheer size and mystery of it all. While most visitors to Egypt were in awe of the pyramid's historical significance, Twain saw it through a slightly different lens, that of someone who had spent much of his life questioning the world's grand myths. Here it stands as unmovable and absurd as the egos of the pharaohs who built it, he wrote, looking up at the stone monument. It's the ultimate display of human ambition an enormous rock pile built by people who had no idea how much we'd end up laughing at them. Twain's dry humor came through once again, even in the face of what many would consider a wonder of the world. He was amazed at how something so ancient could still stand, considering the colossal forces of nature and time that it had withstood. But instead of reverence, Twain could only wonder about the absurdity of it all. For all its size, he mused, this pyramid doesn't look like much more than a really fancy tombstone. But Twain wasn't entirely dismissive of the pyramid. He understood its significance. After all, it had been a symbol of Egypt's grandeur for thousands of years. Yet what fascinated him wasn't the pyramid's religious or cultural importance. It was the strange contrast between the ancient and the modern. Here in the shadow of this enormous stone structure were tourists taking photos, selling trinkets and bargaining for souvenirs. The sacred and the commercial had collided once again, and Twain found the scene both amusing and perplexing. I wonder, he said, how long it'll be before they start selling pyramid packages with discounted rates for groups. Historians still argue whether Twain's criticism of the pyramid's role in Egyptian culture was a true reflection of his skepticism or just a playful jab at the historical weight of the monument. What's clear, though, is that Twain's humor came from a place of curiosity, a desire to observe the human tendency to create meaning and importance from things that to him seemed entirely absurd. Even in the presence of something as grand as the Great Pyramid, Twain found himself observing the human need to attach significance to monuments, as though the object itself had more meaning than the people who gazed upon it. Twain's journey through Cairo was filled with more of the same humorous observations. Walking through the city, he was struck by the contrasts. The vibrant, lively streets filled with people selling everything from fresh bread to exotic spices, all set against the backdrop of ancient monuments. This was the world Twain loved to explore, places where history and modern life collided, where the old world met the new, and where the absurd was often hidden in plain sight. He wrote about the bustling marketplaces, the strange smells and the sounds of commerce with a combination of admiration and exasperation, wondering how anyone could maintain their sanity amid such chaos. It's like being in a carnival, he quipped, but one where the prize is dust and the ride is a donkey. His observations of Cairo were not merely about the grandeur of the monuments or the chaos of the streets. They were about the people. Twain, ever the social observer, noted the peculiarities of the local population, particularly the street vendors, who seemed to be always in a state of frenzied bargaining. His wit was sharp, but never mean-spirited. He marveled at how the vendors could turn every transaction into an elaborate performance. A man in Cairo doesn't sell you a scarf. He said he sells you an experience, a transaction wrapped in layers of negotiation and charisma. Through it all, Twain maintained his distinct voice, a blend of amusement, skepticism, and affection for the absurdity of human behavior. As he wandered through the ancient city, he saw history in the making, but he also saw the timeless nature of human folly, the desire for wealth, power, and status, all wrapped up in the grand performances of life. By the time Twain left Cairo, he had spent a fair amount of time reflecting on the contrast between the ancient ruins and the bustling modern city. The pyramids, with their massive stones and symbolic significance, seemed worlds apart from the small moments of everyday life he witnessed in the streets. Yet in Twain's eyes, it was this very contrast, the way ancient and modern, sacred and profane could coexist, that made his journey so rich with meaning. His travels, filled with humor and sharp observation, allowed him to explore the world with both wonder and wit, reminding us that the absurd is often as profound as the sacred. By now, Mark Twain had spent considerable time in the ancient cities of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Cairo, and his journey was far from over. As he continued down the Nile River, Twain found himself in another chapter of his Middle Eastern adventure that was filled with both awe and bewilderment. You see, Twain was no stranger to waterborne travel. He had spent plenty of time in his native America navigating the mighty Mississippi. But the Nile presented a different kind of experience. This wasn't just a river to be crossed. This was a river that connected history, culture, and legend in a way that no other river did. Twain embarked on a riverboat journey down the Nile, a journey that would take him past ancient temples, the ruins of once great cities, and landscapes that had been painted in history books and legends for centuries. But of course, for Twain, there was always humor in the details. As he sailed down the Nile, he found plenty of things to poke fun at, even in this awe-inspiring setting. The journey itself, which many would have considered a serene or even sacred experience, became the perfect vehicle for Twain's wry observations. First, Twain was struck by the sheer immensity of the Nile, a river that stretched across the vast expanse of Egypt. He noted how in the haze of the desert heat, the river appeared as if it were slicing the land in two, a great liquid vein that pumped life into the ancient heart of Egypt. To Twain, the Nile was far more than just a river. It was a lifeline, an artery, that had nourished civilizations for thousands of years. But of course, he couldn't help but laugh at the idea of it being anything more than a rather large waterway. To call the Nile a river, Twain quipped, is like calling a crocodile a lizard. Both are technically correct, but the scale is a bit off. As Twain's boat made its way past the temples of Luxor and the Valley of the Kings, he found himself in awe of the ancient ruins that lined the banks of the river. These monumental structures, which had once been the pride of Egyptian kings and gods, were now little more than weathered stone relics standing guard over the past. Twain was as always impressed by the scale of these ancient ruins, but it was the sheer absurdity of the whole enterprise that caught his attention. He marveled at how, after thousands of years, these structures still stood seemingly impervious to time. I wonder, he mused, if the Egyptians ever imagined that one day their grand monuments would become little more than photo opportunities for tourists. Yet even in the faces of his own skepticism, Twain couldn't deny the magnificence of the temples and tombs he passed. In his own way, he was experiencing something profoundly moving, even if his natural inclination was to inject a little humor into every sacred space. He watched as his fellow passengers aboard the riverboat stood in awe of the temples and discussed the ancient gods and kings who had once ruled Egypt. And while Twain didn't share their sense of reverence, he did see the allure of these places, the way they evoked both awe and a sense of mystery. "It's like they built these temples to stand forever," Twain remarked, but forgot to tell the tourists that they're not meant to be used as souvenir shops. Historians still argue whether Twain's observations of Egypt's ancient monuments were an intentional commentary on the fleeting nature of human ambition, or whether he was simply mocking the tourists who visited these sites. Regardless of the intent, his humor remained a vehicle for reflection. The majestic ruins and temples were symbols of a once great civilization, and Twain's sharp wit was a way of confronting the contrast between their past glory and their present-day reality as tourist attractions. The journey down the Nile also allowed Twain to encounter the Egyptians in a way he hadn't before. While he had observed the hustle and bustle of Cairo, he now found himself on a riverboat, surrounded by both locals and foreigners, each with their own stories to tell. Some of the local Egyptian boatmen who steered their boats up and down the river caught Twain's attention with their rhythmic singing and calm demeanor. To him, they embodied the very essence of the Egyptian spirit, stoic, quiet, and always willing to share a moment of peace even in the face of the mighty river that sustained them. Yet as much as Twain appreciated the peacefulness of the riverboat journey, he couldn't resist the urge to poke fun at the less serene aspects of it. "It's amazing," he wrote, "how a peaceful boat ride down the Nile can turn into a contest of who can make the loudest, most enthusiastic sales pitch." It seemed that no matter where Twain went, whether it was the sacred sites of Jerusalem or the tranquil banks of the Nile, he couldn't escape the familiar human drive to sell, bargain, and hustle. Even here on the ancient river that had once served as the lifeblood of a great civilization, commerce still held sway. Twain's time on the Nile was one of his most reflective moments in the Holy Land, as he watched the ebb and flow of life around him. It was on this journey that he truly began to understand how interconnected human history was, how even the smallest moments like a boat ride down the Nile could carry with them the weight of centuries of culture and legacy. And while he may have found humor in the absurdities of the world around him, Twain also recognized the profound depth of human experience that existed beyond the jokes and observations. For Twain, the Nile was both a symbol of the past and a reflection of the present. A river that connected the ancient with the modern, the sacred with the mundane. And as he drifted down its waters, he couldn't help but marvel at how this one river had shaped the course of civilization for millennia. The journey wasn't just about the past, it was about understanding how the present was shaped by the ghosts of history, a concept that would continue to fascinate him as he moved on to the next leg of his journey. Twain's river journey along the Nile was a quiet contemplation of Egypt's ancient grandeur, but it was also a profound reminder of the passing of time, a theme he often returned to during his travels. As he continued down the river, he came upon the pyramids of Giza once more. This time, instead of observing them from the bustle of the city or in the company of fellow tourists, Twain found himself alone with his thoughts as he reflected on the meaning of these great structures. They had been standing for thousands of years, their original purpose lost to time, yet they continued to cast long shadows over the surrounding landscape. Twain's thoughts turned inward as he stood before these colossal monuments. "You could stand here for hours," he wrote, "and watch the sun cast its golden light over these stones. But when night falls, the shadows of history seem to grow even longer." There was something deeply humbling about standing before structures that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of civilizations, and the slow march of history. Twain, ever the skeptic, couldn't help but view the pyramids with a mixture of reverence and amusement. How curious it was, he thought, that humans had once believed they could build something that would transcend time itself. These pharaohs, he mused, surely thought they could outlive time with their tombs, but here we are a few thousand years later, and they're just a convenient tourist attraction. This juxtaposition, the grand, unyielding stones of the pyramids and the crowds of tourists snapping photographs, was something Twain couldn't ignore. He described the scene with his signature humor, poking fun at the absurdity of the contrast. "It's quite a spectacle," he wrote, "watching people pose for pictures in front of the pyramids. The only thing missing is a hot dog stand and a few carnival rides." But beneath his sarcasm, Twain recognized something deeper. The pyramids in their silent majesty were not just relics of the past, they were symbols of the human desire to leave something behind that would last. Twain's musings about the pyramids weren't merely about their size or their historical significance. They were about the nature of legacy itself. How much of human history, he wondered, was driven by the desire to be remembered? The pyramids were a clear example of that, a colossal effort by ancient rulers to ensure that their names would be passed down through the ages. And yet Twain pondered, here we are with a modern world that's forgotten who these people even were. He wasn't dismissing the pyramids as irrelevant or insignificant. Instead, he was pointing out the irony of how even the greatest human efforts could be rendered distant, forgotten, or misunderstood by future generations. Historians still debate whether Twain's reflections on the pyramids were meant to be a critique of the ancient Egyptians' obsession with immortality, or whether he was simply using the pyramids to comment on the nature of human legacy itself. Either way, his observations were a reminder that time has a funny way of blurring the lines between greatness and obscurity. The pyramids, which had once been the grandest structures on Earth, were now just another stop on the tourist trail, as commodified as any other attraction in the modern world. After his visit to the pyramids, Twain continued on his journey, heading towards the bustling city of Alexandria. He wasn't quite finished with Egypt, yet there was still more to see, more to question, and more to laugh about. But as he left the great pyramids behind, he took with him a deeper understanding of their place in history. To Twain, the pyramids weren't just about grandeur, they were about the absurdity of trying to outlast time itself. And in that absurdity he found humor. As he made his way to Alexandria, Twain's thoughts remained on the legacy of ancient civilizations. Alexandria, once the intellectual hub of the ancient world, had seen better days. Its great library, once home to the knowledge of the known world, was long gone, reduced to little more than a memory. The city still held remnants of its former glory, its grand architecture, its rich history, but it was also a city of contradictions. To Twain, it was both a reminder of human achievement and a symbol of the fleeting nature of all things. Twain's time in Alexandria was filled with the same sense of humorous reflection that had defined much of his journey. As he wandered through the ruins of ancient temples and libraries, he couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy mixed with amusement. Isn't it strange, he mused, that people once believed this city would be the seat of all knowledge, yet here we are using its ruins as a backdrop for our modern-day tourist escapades. His humor was never cruel, but it was always keenly observant, pointing out the contrasts between what once was and what had become of it. In his travels, Twain had seen it all, the sacred, the monumental, the ancient, and the modern, and with each new location, his reflections deepened. He had come to understand that history wasn't just about great deeds or monumental structures, it was about the moments in between. The quiet reflections, the subtle contradictions, and the absurdity of human efforts to preserve what they believed mattered. And through it all, Twain's humor allowed him to see both the grandeur and the folly of it all, offering his readers not just a glimpse of history, but a window into the very nature of the human experience. As Twain moved further along the Mediterranean coast and into the ancient city of Alexandria, his journey seemed to take on a new rhythm, unlike the ancient stone-heavy sights of Egypt or the arid dust of the desert. Alexandria offered him the backdrop of a more cosmopolitan world, a city once known for its vast library, its famous lighthouse, and its role as the cultural center of the ancient world. But by the time Twain arrived in the city, Alexandria had long since lost its former glory, and Twain couldn't help but look at the ruins with a mix of awe and sardonic humor. In typical Twain fashion, he didn't simply walk through the ancient streets, admiring the crumbling remnants of once grand structures. No, he marveled at them with a kind of wry amusement, commenting on how the magnificent city of intellect had been reduced to little more than a backdrop for tourists. "This city once held the greatest minds of the ancient world," he wrote. "Now it holds the best falafel stands and some impressive though still crumbling columns." It wasn't as if Twain didn't appreciate the significance of Alexandria. It was, after all, the very heart of ancient knowledge and culture, but his humor, as ever, was tinged with an ironic understanding of how fleeting human achievement could be. Twain's commentary on the state of Alexandria reflected his broader understanding of history, a constant ebb and flow, a cycle of rise and fall, creation and destruction. He pointed out the very human tendency to build something grand, only for it to eventually fade into dust and memory. "It is not just the city that is crumbling," he observed, "but the entire idea of permanence. We're all just doing our best to leave a mark, and some of us, it seems, are doing it better than others." His words may have been tongue-in-cheek, but they contained a deep, almost existential recognition of the impermanence of human efforts. For Twain, Alexandria was yet another reminder of the fragility of civilization. The library, once the most prestigious repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was long gone, destroyed by fire, looted and forgotten. He couldn't help but marvel at how the pursuit of knowledge, once the lifeblood of the city, was now reduced to little more than a few faded signs and the occasional tour guide explaining the mystery of the library's destruction. The irony wasn't lost on him. How curious, he mused, that a city built upon the very foundation of learning has now become a place where the only thing being passed down is the art of bargaining over a street-side souvenir. It was clear that Twain's experience in Alexandria was just another chapter in his ongoing exploration of the tension between the grandeur of history and the often comical, sometimes tragic decay that follows. It seemed to him that the grandiosity of human civilization was doomed to erode over time, leaving only traces of what was once significant. The same held true for the city's once famous lighthouse, which had been one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now only a few remnants remained half buried under the sands of time. And yet, Twain remarked, even in its diminished state, it still guides tourists, just as it guided sailors hundreds of years ago. There's something comforting about that, don't you think? As he explored the city, Twain also took note of the strange contradictions of Alexandria in the 19th century. It was a city steeped in a glorious past, but one that had transformed into a busy, bustling port city, its streets crowded with people from all over the Mediterranean world. The commerce, the noise, the clutter, it was all a far cry from the city that had once housed the brightest minds of antiquity. Twain's observations were peppered with gentle sarcasm as he remarked on the bustling port and the haphazard mix of cultures. It's as though the very idea of a unified civilization went out the window a few hundred years ago, he joked. Now it's just a giant marketplace with a few nice ruins to look at. Historians continue to debate whether Twain's tone in describing Alexandria was one of pure cynicism or whether it was a reflection of his tendency to find humor in everything, including the decline of once great civilizations. One thing is certain, though, Twain's perspective was always shaped by his view of history as something that was both cyclical and inherently absurd. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations not as a tragedy, but as a natural part of the human condition, a condition that would continue no matter how many monuments we built or how many books we wrote. In this light, the ruins of Alexandria, far from being a sad reminder of what had been lost, were simply another chapter in the ongoing story of human folly and ambition. As Twain's time in Alexandria came to a close, he found himself reflecting on the larger themes that had shaped his journey: the absurdity of human endeavor, the inevitable passage of time, and the way we all struggle to make a lasting mark on the world. In Alexandria, he saw the echoes of this struggle from the grand monuments to the crumbling ruins. But even in the face of decay, Twain found something strangely comforting. Perhaps it was the fact that, despite everything, humans continued to pursue greatness, even if the pursuit was doomed to fail. At least we try, Twain mused with a characteristic shrug, and that's more than some can say. As Twain departed Alexandria and continued his journey through the Middle East, he found himself in yet another land of ancient monuments and lost civilizations, Egypt's Nile Delta. While this area wasn't quite as well known for its grand temples and pyramids, it had its own quiet allure. And as always, Twain was quick to notice the peculiarities that others might have missed. As he made his way through the Egyptian countryside, the landscape began to shift. The fertile lands of the Nile Delta provided a stark contrast to the dry, barren stretches of desert he had encountered earlier in his travels. The delta, with its lush greenery and dense vegetation, was a dramatic reminder of how the Nile itself had shaped the culture and landscape of Egypt. For Twain, the shift in scenery was an opportunity to reflect on the power of rivers to shape civilizations. The Nile had provided Egypt with sustenance for millennia, but it had also been the source of countless human stories. A river like this, Twain noted, could give life to 1,000 empires and swallow them whole in the same breath. In his typically sardonic way, he marveled at how much the river had shaped Egypt from its agricultural success to its complex mythology. One river, one history, Twain mused, and yet 1,000 different ideas of what that history means. As he observed the vast swathes of farmland on either side of the river, he couldn't help but feel that the Nile was more than just a body of water. It was the thread that tied together the entire fabric of Egyptian life. But Twain, ever the cynic, also took the opportunity to poke fun at the idea of Egypt's historical weight. "One gets the sense that the Egyptians thought their river was divine," he said. And perhaps they were right. It certainly divinely nourished their crops and gave them a reason to talk endlessly about their gods and kings. As he passed through villages that had been built up along the Nile for generations, Twain observed that for many, the river was still an essential part of daily life, whether as a source of food transportation or a source of stories. The river's enduring presence had created an almost mythological reverence for it, a reverence that Twain found equal parts amusing and fascinating. Historians still debate the role of rivers in shaping civilizations, with many pointing to the Nile as the prime example of how one geographic feature can influence everything from politics to religion to culture. Twain, however, was far less interested in the grand theories of historians. For him, the power of the Nile was more about the everyday life it sustained, and how people from ancient times to the present had lived in its shadow. To think, he remarked, that the very same water that was good enough for Cleopatra is now what people use to wash their laundry and fish for dinner. As Twain continued his journey through the Delta, he had one more curious experience that seemed almost tailor-made for his brand of humor. He came across a local merchant who was attempting to sell Twain some traditional Egyptian textiles, but the transaction quickly devolved into a rather comical exchange. The merchant, eager to make a sale, extolled the virtues of his goods with a flair that made Twain wonder whether the whole thing was an elaborate con. "These are the finest fabrics from the banks of the Nile," the merchant said, "woven with ancient techniques passed down through generations." Twain, not one to pass up an opportunity for a joke, raised an eyebrow. "Really?" he said. "I didn't realize the ancient Egyptians were known for their fine fabric work. I thought they were more into building pyramids and writing hieroglyphs." The merchant, undeterred, insisted that the quality of the textiles was unparalleled, and Twain, never one to back down from a good-natured back and forth, made a deal. "I'll buy the cloth," he said, "but only if you tell me whether it was blessed by the Nile itself." This playful exchange was more than just a sales pitch for Twain. It was a moment where he could reflect on the absurdities of both modern commerce and the romanticized history of the land he was traveling through. Throughout his journey in Egypt, Twain continued to reflect on the ever-present tension between the grand history of the place and the daily realities of life in the present. For him, Egypt was more than just the land of pharaohs and pyramids. It was a land where the past and the present constantly collided. The remnants of ancient civilizations might stand proudly along the riverbanks, but the people living there today had their own stories to tell, their own lives to lead, and their own versions of history to navigate. Twain's journey down the Nile Delta offered him a final, more personal reflection on the power of history, both as an object of fascination and a source of humor. The river that had once nurtured the great civilizations of Egypt now flowed through a modern world of farmers, merchants, and tourists, each with their own connection to the past. But for Twain, the connection was always filtered through a lens of sharp wit and sharp observation. He recognized the importance of these places, but he never allowed himself to get too caught up in their grandeur. For him, the true wonder of Egypt, and indeed the world, was not in its monuments, but in the absurdities and quirks of human existence. As he moved on from the Nile Delta, Twain carried with him a deeper understanding of Egypt's complexity. The history, the culture, the landscape, it was all part of a living, breathing world that had endured for thousands of years. And in his own way, Twain had come to understand that it wasn't the pyramids or the pharaohs that made Egypt unforgettable. It was the people, the stories, and the humor that allowed its legacy to live on. Leaving Egypt behind, Twain's adventure continued with an exploration of the grand and mysterious land of Persia, known today as Iran. Persia had long been a crossroads of civilizations, its history stretching back thousands of years. For Twain, however, Persia represented yet another fascinating and often humorous mystery. He was particularly intrigued by its ancient traditions and customs, which in his eyes were both quaint and baffling. His arrival in Persia was a natural extension of his journey, a land full of history, myth, and strange new wonders. And as always, he approached it with his characteristic humor and skepticism. Upon arriving in Persia, Twain couldn't help but be struck by the stark contrast between the ancient ruins he'd just left behind in Egypt and the more living, breathing aspects of Persian culture. Whereas Egypt's monumental temples, tombs, and pyramids were all about the grandeur of the past, Persia seemed more alive with the rhythm of its present. The city streets were bustling with merchants, the scent of spice and incense filled the air, and the streets seemed to hum with life. Yet even amidst the liveliness, Twain couldn't help but notice the peculiarities of Persian society. The old traditions so firmly embedded in the culture stood in stark contrast to the evolving world that Twain himself came from. One of the first things Twain noticed was the manner in which Persian men conducted themselves in public. They were often seen in flowing robes adorned with intricately embroidered sashes and carrying themselves with a kind of dignity that seemed almost comical to Twain. It's a curious thing, he mused, to see so many men so carefully dressed as though they were preparing for an event, but the event is always the same, simply walking through the streets. He observed that the elaborate nature of the attire seemed to be more for show than practicality. If only they knew, he said with a chuckle, how much easier it would be to catch a breeze in a simpler outfit. Twain's humor wasn't meant to be mocking, however. It was his way of making sense of the unfamiliar. The grandeur of Persian culture, particularly in its clothing, struck him as both theatrical and fascinating. He compared it to the extravagant garb of European aristocracy, noting that it's as though everyone in Persia is preparing for an unspoken performance, a performance where the script is always the same, but the costumes are more elaborate each time. Yet, as with his previous observations of cultures throughout the Middle East, Twain found a sense of wonder in these customs, even if they seemed excessive or overly complicated to him. But it wasn't just the dress that captured Twain's attention in Persia. It was the food, the markets, and the customs that defined daily life, in a way that seemed so different from anything he had ever known. In one particular market, Twain was struck by the sheer variety of goods available. It wasn't just spices, silks, and carpets. There were also strange fruits and vegetables, some of which he had never seen before. The fruit here, Twain wrote, is more exotic than any I've tasted in my life. Some of it looks like something a person should admire from afar, but I'm not sure I want to take a bite. He described the exotic fruit with a sense of mock horror, but also with genuine curiosity about the unfamiliar flavors and textures. Twain's exploration of Persian cuisine wasn't just about the food itself, it was about the rituals that surrounded it. The process of eating was often as much a performance as it was a necessity. Meals were not quick affairs. They were drawn-out social events, often lasting for hours. It's quite the affair, Twain noted with amusement, to sit down for a meal here. No one is in a hurry. The food is passed around like a sacred relic, and every bite is savored, as if it were the last one. He marveled at the reverence with which meals were treated, and the way people seemed to approach the act of eating with the seriousness usually reserved for religious rituals. It struck him as a delightful contradiction. People treated their meals as though they were as important as the great kings and warriors of Persia's past. Historians still debate the role of food and eating rituals in Persian culture, with some arguing that it was a form of hospitality that transcended simple nourishment, while others suggest that it was a reflection of the Persians' love of beauty and excess. Twain, of course, was far more focused on the comicality of the situation. It's no wonder that the Persian kings had such opulent palaces, he quipped. If they ate like this every day, they'd need a palace just to store the leftovers. As Twain wandered deeper into Persia, his observations became more reflective. The contrast between Persia's ancient culture and the bustling modern world he had known was never more apparent than in the way the city streets were filled with both the old and the new. On one hand, you had the ancient customs, religious practices, old marketplace traditions, and the continuation of centuries-old rituals. On the other, there were the modern technologies and new ideas that were beginning to shape the Persian world. Twain's observations captured this tension perfectly as he marveled at how the ancient and the modern coexisted in a strange harmony. It was a bit like being on a stage where the actors were wearing costumes from different time periods, yet somehow they made it work. Twain's time in Persia was a rich blend of humor, reflection, and cultural curiosity. His observations never lost their playful edge, but they were also marked by a deep respect for the complexities of Persian life. While he might have poked fun at the elaborate clothing or the ritualistic approach to meals, he also saw the value in these customs. For Twain, it wasn't just about laughing at the absurdities of the world. It was about understanding the unique beauty that these customs brought to people's lives, even if they seemed strange or excessive. His journey through Persia, like his travels through the rest of the Middle East, was a reminder that human culture in all its forms is defined by its contradictions. It is a blend of the grand and the absurd, the serious and the playful, the ancient and the modern. And as always, Twain found that there was much to learn from both sides of the equation. As Twain's journey across the Middle East and Persia continued, his next stop took him to the legendary lands of India, a country that to many Westerners of the time seemed both mystical and baffling. Twain, of course, was no ordinary traveler. His curious mind and sharp wit meant that India, with its rich tapestry of cultures, religions, and contradictions, would be an endless source of material for him to poke fun at, while also admiring its complexity. Upon arriving in India, Twain was immediately struck by the sheer sensory overload of the place. The air was thick with the smell of spices. The streets teemed with life, and the cacophony of sounds, from the calls of street vendors to the distant rumblings of holy men chanting, filled the atmosphere. For Twain, accustomed to the more structured, quieter surroundings of Europe and America, India was nothing short of overwhelming. And yet it was this very chaos that drew him in, providing him with the perfect backdrop for his observations. His first encounter with Indian life came in the bustling streets of Calcutta, now Kolkata. Twain found himself in the middle of a city that was teeming with people, animals, and an odd mix of the modern and the ancient. Elephants wandered through the streets, while horse-drawn carriages clattered by, and yet in the midst of it all, there was a strange order to the chaos. The streets are crowded, Twain wrote, but not in the way that a crowded street is in New York or London. Here there's a sort of flow, a rhythm that feels almost like a dance. He marveled at the way people moved through the streets, seemingly unaffected by the throngs around them. It's as if they know something we don't, he mused, like they're all part of some ancient rhythm that the rest of us are just now catching on to. One of the most striking features of India for Twain was the contrast between the poverty of its streets and the opulence of its royal palaces. In Calcutta, he saw the stark contrast between the wealthy elite who lived in sprawling mansions and the poor who lived in crowded slums. It's a curious thing, he wrote. The great divide between the classes here is more obvious than in any place I've ever been. On one street, you have men dressed in silk and jewels, while on the next, you have people begging for food in the streets. It's as though the very idea of wealth has been turned into a kind of performance. Twain's sharp commentary on the social divide in India wasn't meant to be cruel. Instead, it reflected his fascination with the way human beings construct and maintain systems of inequality. The rich live in their palaces, he wrote, and the poor live in their hovels. But in a way they're all living in the same world, one filled with gods, animals, and a very curious idea of what constitutes happiness. But it wasn't just the social inequality that intrigued Twain. It was the pervasive influence of religion in every aspect of life. India was, of course, a land steeped in spiritual tradition, from Hinduism to Buddhism to Jainism, and Twain was both fascinated and perplexed by the variety of religious practices he encountered. At one point, he visited a Hindu temple where he was struck by the fervor with which people participated in their rituals. "It is a curious thing," he remarked, "to see a man who can walk barefoot over burning coals without flinching, but who won't take a step outside without his sandals on." Twain was both impressed and amused by the devotion he saw, particularly when it came to the more unusual practices like asceticism or self-mortification. "It's amazing," he wrote, "how far some people will go to prove their devotion. If walking over hot coals doesn't do it, I don't know what will." His humor, of course, was not meant to belittle these practices. It was simply his way of reconciling the deep spirituality of the place with his more skeptical worldview. Twain was always at his best when he was in the midst of cultures that were completely different from his own, and India's rich spiritual landscape provided him with a wealth of material. As he wandered through the crowded streets and visited temples and shrines, he often found himself bemused by the strange, sometimes contradictory beliefs he encountered. "The thing about India," he wrote, "is that it's a land where everything is possible. From walking on fire to turning one's self into a human statue, it's all part of the daily routine." One of Twain's most famous anecdotes from his time in India involved the famous Indian holy man Swami Vivekananda. Twain, ever the curious observer, took a keen interest in Vivekananda's teachings, particularly his ideas about spiritual enlightenment and the unity of all religions. The two men met several times, and Twain found himself both charmed and challenged by the Swami's philosophical ideas. "He talks about the unity of all religions," Twain said, "and yet he's the first to tell me that his own religion is the only true one." It's an odd thing, this belief in unity. Despite his skepticism, Twain was moved by the Swami's deep conviction and the sense of purpose he brought to his life's work. "There's something about him," Twain remarked. "You can't help but listen when he speaks. It's as if he's found the answer to all the questions that everyone else is still asking." Historians continue to debate Twain's true feelings about India and its religious practices. Was he genuinely fascinated by the country's spiritual traditions, or was he simply using them as a source of humor and satire? Some argue that Twain's writings on India reflect his deep respect for the country's rich cultural heritage, while others suggest that his irreverence was a reflection of his skepticism towards all forms of organized religion. Regardless of his motivations, it's clear that Twain's time in India left a lasting impression on him, a blend of admiration, confusion, and humor that would color his reflections for years to come. After his time in India, Twain's next destination took him to the ancient city of Baghdad, a place that in his eyes was both a mysterious and ancient relic, and yet a living, bustling hub of the Middle East. Twain's arrival in Baghdad was less about history and more about the curious mix of old-world mysticism and modern-day life that continued to define his journey through this part of the world. Baghdad, once a center of knowledge and culture during the Islamic Golden Age, was now a city of contradictions where crumbling mosques stood in the shadow of modern markets, and where the vast, complex history of the place was often overshadowed by the day-to-day bustle of urban life. Twain, never one to shy away from exploring contradictions, was immediately struck by the juxtaposition of these two worlds. As he walked through the city, he found that the once great city, which had once rivaled cities like Cairo and Cordoba for its wealth and intellectual contributions, now had a rather disheveled yet still captivating quality to it. Walking through the market streets of Baghdad, Twain couldn't help but be amused by the vibrant chaos. The sounds of merchants shouting their wares, the clattering of donkeys, and the hustle of the crowd created an overwhelming sense of activity. Yet it was the small moments that seemed to capture Twain's attention. I find it remarkable, he noted, how, even in the midst of so much chaos, there's a certain rhythm to life here. It's not just noise, it's a dance. but I still don't know if I'm part of the dance or just watching it from the sidelines. Twain's observations weren't just limited to the markets and city streets. As he wandered through the ancient quarters of Baghdad, he found himself drawn to the city's rich literary tradition despite its current state of disrepair. The old libraries and cultural centers that had once housed the greatest minds of the Arab world were now largely forgotten, abandoned, or repurposed for other uses. Twain, ever the writer, couldn't help but reflect on the irony of this. It seems strange, he wrote, that a city once known as a beacon of intellectual light now struggles to keep its history intact. It's as though time has walked over these great minds, leaving little more than a shadow of what once was. But even with the decaying remnants of Baghdad's former greatness, Twain was still struck by the sense of reverence people held for the city's past. As he visited the old palaces and mosques, he felt a deep respect for the cultural and religious heritage that these buildings represented. He marveled at the intricate tile work, the delicate calligraphy, and the sheer scale of the structures that had once stood as symbols of power and learning. And yet, even as he admired their beauty, he couldn't resist pointing out the fact that these great buildings, though impressive, seemed oddly out of place in a city struggling to find its footing in the modern world. Historians continue to debate whether Twain's reflections on Baghdad's decline were a critique of the city's present state, or a more general commentary on the nature of civilizations themselves. Some argue that Twain's observations were a reflection of his own frustration with the way the world's great cities often lose touch with their cultural and intellectual roots. Others suggest that his humor was simply his way of coping with the overwhelming sense of loss that he felt in a place once so full of promise. Either way, Twain's reflections on Baghdad were a powerful reminder that even the most vibrant civilizations are subject to the ravages of time and circumstance. As Twain continued his exploration of Baghdad, he found that his time there, though brief, had a lasting impact on him. He began to understand the complex relationship between the past and the present, the way cities once great can become shadows of themselves. It is strange, he mused, how a place can be both full of life and full of ghosts at the same time. It's as if the city is trying to hold on to its past while moving forward into the future. And yet, despite the city's challenges, Twain was moved by the resilience of its people. The merchants who still plied their trade in the markets, the scholars who continued to study and teach in their humble corners, and the people who still held on to their cultural traditions, these were the true heartbeat of Baghdad, the ones who kept the city alive in their own quiet, unspoken way. It's easy to look at a place like Baghdad and think it has lost its way, Twain wrote. But if you look close enough, you'll see that it's still full of life, full of people who refuse to let its past be forgotten. As he departed the city, Twain reflected on the strange paradox that had defined his time in Baghdad. It was a city full of history, full of beauty, but also full of contradictions. And in those contradictions, he saw the essence of human civilization itself, ever-evolving, ever-changing, and yet always marked by the same cycles of rise and fall. For Twain, Baghdad was just another example of the way time and history shape the world, creating a complex tapestry of triumphs and failures, of brilliance and decay. In the end, Twain's time in Baghdad was a reminder that no city, no civilization is ever truly static. Whether through the grandeur of ancient monuments or the everyday hustle of life, the past and present are always intertwined, shaping one another in ways that are both humbling and amusing. It was this recognition of the ever-present tension between the old and the new that allowed Twain to approach his journey through the Middle East with both humor and reflection. With Baghdad now behind him, Twain found himself drawn to a place that had captivated the imagination of travelers for centuries, the fabled land of Mesopotamia. This ancient cradle of civilization, where the first cities were built and writing was invented, was a land steeped in myth and legend. For Twain, it represented both the birth of human culture and a profound mystery a place where history and myth seemed to blend together in the most fascinating and at times absurd ways. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a region that had seen the rise and fall of some of the most powerful empires in history: the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. Yet as Twain explored the remnants of these ancient civilizations, he found a land that, while rich in history, was also marked by a sense of abandonment. The great cities that had once been the centers of power were now little more than mounds of rubble, with only faint traces of their former grandeur left behind. One of Twain's first stops in Mesopotamia was the ancient city of Ur, famous for its ziggurat, a massive step pyramid that had once served as a temple to the moon god Nana. As Twain stood before the ruins of this once great city, he couldn't help but marvel at the audacity of the ancient Sumerians. It's hard to imagine, he wrote, that a people once built this enormous temple to a god they believed lived on top of the world. And now it's just another pile of bricks waiting for someone else to come and make a story out of it. Twain's dry humor here wasn't meant to be dismissive. It was simply his way of highlighting the fleeting nature of human ambition. The ziggurat, which had once stood as a testament to the power of the Sumerian kings, was now little more than a curiosity for tourists. As he explored further, Twain encountered the remnants of other great cities of Mesopotamia: Babylon, Nineveh, and Assur, each with its own stories of glory and ruin. Twain was fascinated by the fact that these cities, which had once held great power, were now reduced to little more than myths and legends. Babylon in particular was a place that had captured the imagination of countless travelers and writers throughout history. The city's hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, had long since disappeared, but the myth of their existence persisted. The problem with places like Babylon, Twain mused, is that they are so full of stories and legends that no one can ever tell if they were truly great or just really good at marketing. Despite his sarcastic tone, Twain was deeply moved by the ruins of these cities, not just for their historical significance, but for the sense of timelessness they evoked. Standing among the crumbling walls of Babylon, Twain found himself reflecting on the nature of history itself. "It's funny, isn't it," he wrote, "how we all think our great works will last forever. And yet here I stand in the ruins of a city that once thought itself invincible, looking at the remnants of something that once held the power to change the world." In that moment, Twain understood that the fall of great civilizations wasn't just about the passage of time, it was about the inherent fragility of all human endeavors. In his exploration of Mesopotamia, Twain also encountered the first traces of written language, particularly in the form of cuneiform. The Sumerians, who had developed this early form of writing, had left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with their laws, stories, and myths. As Twain perused these ancient texts, he couldn't help but marvel at the ingenuity of these early writers. "It's a curious thing," he observed, "to think that the people who lived here thousands of years ago were able to communicate with us through their writing while we are still struggling to understand their language. Perhaps they were better at preserving their thoughts than we are." Twain's humor and wit were never far from his observations, but his time in Mesopotamia also led him to reflect on the nature of civilization itself. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians had built vast empires only to see them crumble into dust. But in their ruins, there was something enduring, something that transcended the passage of time. Twain was reminded that the stories we tell, the buildings we construct, and the civilizations we create are all part of a larger, ever-evolving narrative. "The great cities of Mesopotamia," he wrote, "may have disappeared, but their stories are still here, written in the dust and the stones, waiting for someone to read them." Historians still argue over the meaning of Mesopotamia's decline and the lessons it offers to modern civilizations. Was the fall of these ancient empires inevitable, or were there factors that led to their downfall that could have been avoided? Twain's observations, though humorously tinged with irony, offered a powerful insight into the transient nature of human history. He saw that no empire, no matter how mighty, could escape the ravages of time. The ruins of Mesopotamia, once the seat of power, were now just another chapter in the story of human ambition and failure. Yet for Twain there was a certain comfort in the ruins. As he stood amid the remnants of these great cities, he found solace in the idea that even in their decline, these ancient civilizations had left behind a legacy, albeit a fractured one, that still spoke to us today. Perhaps, he mused, that's what we all leave behind, fragments of ourselves that will outlast our lifetimes but ultimately fade away into the dust. As he prepared to leave Mesopotamia, Twain's reflections turned inward. His time in this ancient land had given him a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human civilization, its rise, its fall, and the strange way that history often repeats itself. But true to form, Twain ended his time in Mesopotamia with a laugh. In the end, he said, the ruins of Mesopotamia will stand for one thing, only proof that even the best of us are destined to be forgotten, one brick at a time. As Twain prepared to return home after his long and meandering journey through the Middle East and beyond, he found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned, not just about the places he had visited, but about the nature of human civilization itself. His travels had taken him to some of the world's most ancient and mysterious lands: Egypt, Persia, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Each place had offered him a new perspective on history, culture, and human nature, but in the end, it was the contradictions of these civilizations, both their grandeur and their flaws, that seemed to stick with him the most. One of the most striking things about Twain's travels was how he managed to find humor in nearly everything. From the sacred rituals in India to the decaying ruins of Mesopotamia, Twain's sharp wit never failed him. Yet beneath his sarcasm, there was a deep sense of wonder, a recognition that even in the most absurd corners of the world, there was something profoundly human. Whether he was laughing at the opulent extravagance of Persian merchants or reflecting on the fall of ancient empires, Twain's humor was always a way of coping with the complexities and contradictions he encountered. Twain's reflections as he journeyed home also turned inward. He had spent years exploring the world, looking for answers for something that would make sense of the chaos he often observed. Yet, in many ways, his travels had only deepened the mystery of it all. The more I see, he mused, the less I understand. It's as though the more I discover, the more I realize how little we actually know. Twain was, of course, no stranger to doubt. His skepticism had been evident throughout his travels, but it was tempered with a kind of respect for the complexities of the world. In the end, he realized there was no easy answer to the questions he had posed. History, culture, and humanity were all part of a great sprawling narrative that no one would ever fully understand. And yet it was this very uncertainty that seemed to give life its beauty. As Twain made his way home, he reflected on how history's great monuments, whether the pyramids of Egypt or the ruins of Mesopotamia, were not just relics of the past. They were symbols of humanity's drive to leave something behind, to be remembered long after their creators were gone. And though these monuments may one day fall into ruin, the stories they told would live on. Perhaps Twain said that's all we can hope for, some small corner of our story, some trace of our lives to survive the ravages of time. As he boarded his ship for the long journey back to America, Twain found himself struck by how much the world had changed in just a few short months. The people, the places, the customs, they all seemed so far away now, and yet the memories of his travels lingered. The laughter, the strange sights, and the sometimes baffling customs had all left an indelible mark on him. And as much as he had joked about the absurdities he encountered, Twain knew that he would never quite be the same. His perspective on the world had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had set out on this journey with the expectation that he would find something to laugh at. And he had, of course. But in the end, he had found something more, a deeper understanding of the complexity. complexities of human existence. For all his humor, Twain's journey had also been a deeply philosophical one. The ruins of ancient cities, the rituals of foreign peoples, the grandeur of lost empires, they all served as reminders that the past was never as distant as we think. It was always with us, woven into the fabric of the present, influencing our actions and shaping our futures. Perhaps Twain mused that's the greatest joke of all. We think we're so advanced, so modern, and yet we are all still living in the shadow of the past. The joke is on us. As the ship sailed toward the horizon, Twain's final thoughts turned to the future, both his own and that of the places he had visited. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, cultures flourish and fade, but he understood that the march of time was inevitable. No matter how much we might try to preserve the past, the future would always find a way to move forward. And yet, despite all the inevitable losses, Twain knew that there was something beautiful in the resilience of humanity. The world may have changed, but the same human spirit that had driven the builders of the pyramids, the writers of the ancient texts, and the merchants of Persia still endured in the hearts of those he had met along his journey. With that final reflection, Twain couldn't help but chuckle to himself, as if he had finally come to terms with the mysteries of the world, even if only in his own way. Perhaps he said it's all just one big joke, and the punchline is yet to come. As the ship sailed into the night, Twain's journey filled with humor, reflection, and discovery came to a close. But the story he had woven over the course of his travels, the one filled with absurdities, contradictions, and the search for meaning, would stay with him, waiting to be shared with others. And for Twain, that was enough, because sometimes the greatest journey isn't the one that takes you across the world, but the one that takes you deeper into yourself. End of script. Sweet dreams.